Everybody, welcome live to the Jim Master Show, live entertainment lifestyle celebrity talk show series. Hope you guys are doing well. Thanks for joining us. Greg, welcome back to the show, my friend.
Thank you very much, Jim. Thank you, everyone watching, and hello to all of the chatting people, the people who are watching this recorded, the people 10 years from now who might be watching it. To you, I say, did you ever think any of that would happen in 10 years? And I did find your album.
Oh my God, there it is.
Yeah. Yeah. That's the one.
I tell you, that's amazing. And that series, again, is deep in our memory bank. And, the JMS Lovities. Yeah, the viewers are the Lovities. So the Lovities are saying hello to you and welcoming you back. It's so good. And you and Greg and I were chatting because, he was on maybe 6-7 months ago. And we were celebrating his amazing work, his contributions to the industry and everything else. And then when this came out, this really special work of art, I said to Greg, hey, I said last time we would keep the porch light on for you. And we always do for our guests. And if you want to come on and celebrate and tell us about this fabulous book, which, again, I got a chance to, just immerse myself in with the preview. So I can vouch that it's something that everybody should have, in their collection, on their bookshelf, on their coffee table. It's going to be amazing. I'm so excited for you and happy for you, and congratulations on this.
Thank you. Oh, and I also want to mention you at the introduction, you were talking about, which I cannot possibly live up to, and I don't know that. You showed 2 books, both published by dear friends at University Press of Mississippi, who have been so supportive and encouraging through all of this. Hanna-Barbera Conversations is a collection of new interviews, existing essays, rare articles, some that I was searching for.
Wow.
And that's edited by Tyler Solon Williams and Kevin Sandler. And that is available now. And that is a fascinating book because it traces through some of these difficult to find accounts as they were happening of what Hanna and Barbera were doing at their studio and what their artists were up to, and how the Taft company bought them in the 60s. Just so many things that I just couldn't stop reading it. It was really good. So it's a very nice complement to what my book is. It's a very different kind of book.
That's fantastic. Tell us about the book and what was the inspiration? How long did it take? I mean, you were saying that it was like giving birth to a baby in many ways, and it was a labor of love, pun intended. Yeah. Beautifully said. What was the spark? Was this something that came upon you, that was presented to you, or was this something that you stumbled upon, or something that for years you always wanted to do, or all of the above?
Well, it's all of the above. I've always wanted to do a book about these records that I love. And it's not just a book about records. And I want to make that clear. It started out as a series of conversations I had with Craig Gill, who is the editorial director at UPM. And we were going back and forth on different ideas. And for many, many years now, I've been writing a column online for cartoonresearch.com called Animation Spin for probably the preeminent historian in animation in general, Jerry Beck. And I was thinking about how some of that could be a starting point for a book. And so Craig and I were talking about it, and he said, I'm thinking a Hanna-Barbera book might be kind of good. And so I've always loved these records. And I was very, very surprised in checking around that there haven't been a whole lot of books about what was at one time the biggest animation studio in the world, employed probably even compared to now, more people, more artists, more staff people than any other studio. And at some points, you could be in any place in the world and there would be one of their cartoons playing somewhere. That's how immense they were. But more than anything else, they had an entertainment influence that affects us today in so many ways. And that's what we really explore in the book. It's told from the very beginning of Bill and Joe's career and how they got started. They met in 1937. They started Tom and Jerry cartoons in 1939. And then when we get to 1945, it's the very first record, which was based on their characters, which is The King Who Couldn't Dance with Gene Kelly. And that is because he did that famous and flawless combination of live action and animation dance sequence with Jerry the Mouse, with a cameo by Tom. And that inspired the record with a little book inside. And from that point on, there were records and tapes and CDs, and to this day, downloads, brand new ones even, based on their characters. And when I started putting together the discography, this is really the first discography that's been published that's as complete as I could get it, because I keep finding things. There's well over 500 titles in the discography. We put in about a little over 140 photographs of either the people we talk about, the stills of the album covers that we talk about. And through that, we're telling the story of the studio, because with Mousetracks, we were talking about a period and a division of a company that has been well documented. There are a lot of Disney historians, and there are a lot of great books. There's some, but there's some very, very good books. Tim Hollis and I set out to talk about the record division, and that's pretty much what we did. The studio itself is in the background. But with Hanna-Barbera, it was different, because people don't know so much about what they did and what they contributed and what they innovated, that other people picked up on. Most definitely the half-hour sitcom that Family Guy and Bob's Burgers, my personal favorite, Bob's Burgers, and Simpsons and Futurama and all those shows, they're the ones who made animation work on television, not just technically and from a budgetary standpoint, but from the narrative form, from the artistic form. And it's arguably, they did it the best, especially in the 60s and 70s and into the 80s. And there's still new films coming out. We just had the Tom and Jerry, and that's where we end the book, with the last Tom and Jerry film in 2021. So we bookend Tom and Jerry to Tom and Jerry, and that had a soundtrack album, and I interviewed the composer for the Tom and Jerry film. That's the one that had Chloe Moretz in it, and it took place in a New York hotel. That was actually a big hit. And that was during COVID, and Warner was giving people the opportunity to stream it for free, and people were still going to theaters and paying to see it, because COVID was starting to slow down a bit, and it was getting safer to go to theaters, and people were paying when they weren't charging extra for Tom and Jerry, even though it was new. That was their policy. Wonder Woman, the second Wonder Woman, also was that way. So even though they could get it for free, they were going to see it in theaters. That's how much people love these characters. Tom and Jerry in particular have never really been off television, according to Jerry Beck, and are always viable. Scooby-Doo, there must be well over 30 or 40 direct-to-video films, specials, different series, formatted series, and any one of these things would be major. But with Hanna-Barbera, it was a massive amount of things.
It's amazing. In order to put it together, too, they really had a lot of people as part of their team. And you talk about that, Chris, whether it's Tom and Jerry or Scooby-Doo, and all these names I'm saying, people are probably, taking them, you and I together, are taking them back in time. The Jetsons, Yogi Bear, Top Cat, Huckleberry Hound, hundreds of others. These creations of Hanna-Barbera, the studio, they, as you're saying, they continue today, even though it's been around decades, to delight generations worldwide. And it really is a groundbreaking company on so many different levels. They employed thousands in the art and business of animation, right, Greg?
Yes. At one point in about 73, according to Tom Cito, who is the professor of animation at USC, it was roughly about 75 to 150 people in the early 70s at Disney, because they did a feature every 3-4 years. But at the same time, Hanna-Barbera was doing so many things and had so many things going on the air. They had more like 1,400, 1,500 people. And yeah, the animation was different, but that isn't the point. The point is that people who were in that business had jobs, could buy groceries, had families to go to. And one of the stories that I have in the book, but I love to share, is from a gentleman, Mark Evanier, who has a great website called newsforme.com. And he told a story once where he was working there, and he said to Bill Hanna, whose job was to get the stuff produced when Joe Barbera brought in the concepts. And he asked Bill Hanna, maybe things could slow down. Maybe if you didn't take in an assignment or something, maybe, one less show. And so he said, Mark, look down that hallway and tell me who to fire. I don't, that's an attitude that's pretty cool. They would bring in new people who had not done a whole lot. They had a training program for many, many years. And then at the same time, some of the classic animators from the 30s who worked at Fleischer and Van Buren and Lance, they gave them work, sometimes when they were not even all that well. Most famously, Tex Avery, who was friends with them at MGM, and he had kind of a rival unit making droopy cartoons and wacky, crazy cartoons, and they sort of fed off each other to make the cartoons crazy. Tex Avery was well into his later years and was not well, and he did Dino and Cave Mouse segments for the Flintstone comedy show, and he did the Quickie Koala show, and passed away. Same thing with Friz Freleng. Early friendships, but long before Friz Freleng was at MGM, they were working at Warner. He was at MGM for a brief time. They became friends when the animation closed. When Warner closed their studio in the early '60s, they brought him in to do work on the Hey There, It's Yogi Bear feature. And then when DePatie Freleng became Marvel Productions, and they weren't doing funny cartoons, they were doing more action stuff mostly. He went back to Bill and Joe and said, what can I do? And he did the Pink Panther and Sons. That was actually a Hanna-Barbera cartoon.
That's right.
So it's a people story as much as it is an animation and a music story. And it's about the people who did the voices, some of the greatest. So if you look at the credits for something like Smurfs, you will see a who's who of actors. And if you know animation, you'll go, wow, I saw that name on a Betty Boop cartoon or on a Woody Woodpecker. Or they used to direct cartoons at Warner Brothers. It was a who's who. And people like Floyd Norman, who's a Disney legend. I've had him on the podcast. He worked on many shows there, and it was fun. It wasn't, they were not pretentious. They did not say, we are making art here, excuse me, but move aside, this is art. They were making cartoons and they were entertaining. And that was the purpose.
I love the way you cut right to that in such a beautiful way. That's exactly what they were doing, and that's exactly what we would hope they were doing. And I think that because of that, that's why it's really gotten into the psyche of society, why it's gotten into people's hearts and souls, why these characters and everything to do with all of these episodes of each of these series and everything that's come along with it, branding, merchandise, anything that's come along with it, people can't seem to get enough of. And it's because of the way that they just treated it with respect and in a way that had humanity in it. And I think that's so important when you're trying to reach people. It's not just art and it's something aloof, but it is something that no matter who watches it, wherever they are around the world, whatever time of day these are on, people will connect with it. And that's not always something easy to do when you're creating art, but they mastered.
Yeah, and then they also were, because it was television, they were moving at a lightning pace. The deadlines were sometimes impossible. The budgets were always at risk, and the budgets got even more. Animation is very expensive and time consuming. And the early shows they did, especially like Flintstones, Top Cat, the Jetsons, and Johnny Quest, the primetime shows were really expensive shows. They were at least $10,000 an episode more than a live action show. And so when people ask, well, why did the Jetsons disappear after 24 years? Well, it didn't disappear because Jetsons and Top Cat and Johnny Quest became even more successful on Saturday morning and then in syndication. And there were only 24 episodes of the Jetsons, yet they ran, and about 30 of Johnny Quest, they ran on all the networks. They ran over and over again, and they were canceled mostly because ABC was a burgeoning network, and like the early Fox that needed The Simpsons, they needed something different. They needed to get an audience and something unique that other networks weren't giving. ABC went with animation, and by the mid 60s, by 65, 66, they had kind of expanded, and more people in the country had TVs. They were going into color. Everything was in color by 66 generally. And ABC didn't need the extra expense when they could make as much money with a less expensive show. And that's the same as today. A live action show is cheaper, a game show, a reality show, sporting events, things like that cost. Same with Saturday morning. News and sports are much cheaper in general than animation. And the other thing is they had networks that were supervising the creative. They had sponsors. And by the late 60s, they had parental pressure groups because there were concerns after the turbulent 1968 events that the violent cartoons may not be good for kids. So there was a whole revamping of that. And by the early 70s, the cartoons had to have some sort of pro-social feel to them. And they survived all that. And Hanna's attitude was, you got to be adaptable. And Barbera's was, we'll sell what we can sell. And if you make us combine 3 or 4 things that don't even fit together, we'll make a show that people will like. It's a dog that turns into a kung fu superhero named Hong Kong Phooey, and there's a lovely receptionist or dispatcher who's madly in love with his alter ego and doesn't know he's Hong Kong Phooey, and he has this following. People seem to know who he is. It makes absolutely no sense when you try to explain it. And you got one theme song to give you the premise. But when you watch it, you go, somehow this works. The people who were working there were some of the top writers, some of the best animators. The backgrounds sometimes were either breathtaking or very artistic and quirky. And they had to do everything very quickly, but well as they could.
Did they feel like what they were doing was unique or special, meaning there's all these others that were out there in various ways, shapes, and forms that were doing various things? Did they concentrate just on what they did and let's do the best we can? Or did they ever feel there was competition, or they had to be number one, or, as others were developing various animated projects? How did they sort of operate in that way? Just don't worry about any of that. Focus on our look and feel and sound, and let's just continue to make excellence every day.
I don't think any creative entity is being honest if they say, I don't look at what others do. I'm motivated by my muse and by inspiration. I think that I was at Disney 30 years. It wasn't like I only went to Disney movies or Disney parks. You wanted to see what others were doing. Walt Disney would screen all kinds of films, Hollywood films, not only at his home, but at the studio as well. It is a good idea to know what the marketplace is because it's a changing marketplace. So they were very aware. They were also very aware because in television you have to be, and so was Walt Disney. You have to be aware of what the trends are and what people, whether it's prime time for families and adults or it's Saturday morning and syndication for kids. You've got to see what is the trend. Hong Kong Phooey was not an accident, because the Kung Fu series with David Carradine was on, and the movies with Bruce Lee were becoming very popular. So this was a spoof of that. There were Mick Jagrock was a character on the Pebbles and Bam Bam show. And then if you look at the original Flintstones, you had Hoagie Carmichael was the first guest, but then they got into rock and roll. You had Ann Margrock on there. You had the guy from Shindig. So they were very aware of what the trends were. They were very aware of what the competition was doing. They were so successful, actually, that one of the reasons that Filmation Studio opened, which I also admire very much. Filmation was created in a way to sort of break the monopoly that Hanna-Barbera was getting, because they were so incredibly successful, and every network wanted to have exclusives. But Filmation came along with some very popular and very well done series. Besides the New Adventures of Superman, which is their first one, they had the Archie show, which was phenomenally successful, and that influenced Hanna-Barbera because, you know, it was the Beatles cartoon in '64, which ran for many years, but it was also the Archies, because suddenly you had a cartoon band that could sell #1 records. So that's where the idea like Chattanooga Cats came from that. Banana Splits was the same year as Archie. But then you had Josie and the Pussycats, which is based on another Archie comic, and then Scooby-Doo, which was teenagers solving mysteries, which was a less threatening, less violent kind of action and adventure. It was like Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein. Right. And so you had that, and then they would just mix and match, because that's what networks do. And let's face it, it's what movies do too. When you always hear the classic pitch, oh, it's some of this and it's some of that, and then we put them together. And so there was a lot of teen solving mysteries. You know, there were meddling kids all over the place in the early '70s. And then then they led the pack in the '80s with Smurfs, because there was never a successful series that took place in a magical fairy tale land that lasted more than a season. There were a couple. Here Comes the Grump, Dr. Dolittle, and Rankin Bass had The Reluctant Dragon and Mr. Toad, but they didn't last long. And NBC was terrified to do the Smurfs. It was Fred Silverman who first came along and said, these characters are popular all over the world. People didn't know them as much in the United States in just before 1981. They were known, but they weren't a phenomenon. They were in Europe, but not here. He bought a Smurf toy for his daughter, and he said, let's take a look at this. They bought the rights. They actually worked directly with the creator of the Smurfs, Peo, Pierre Culliford, and Yvonne Delaporte, who was his translator and associate. And NBC was very worried, because this show didn't have superheroes. It didn't have teens. It didn't have groovy stuff. In fact, one network executive said, I don't want classical music in this show, which the show is based on classical music themes. You can recognize some of them. There's Night on Bald Mountain in there. There's Pastoral Symphony. There's a lot of good stuff, a lot of Mozart and Verdi and stuff. So they had, that was Hoyt Curtin's genius to weave that music in there. She said, kids only want pop. They're going to reject this. And she actually said that she wouldn't air it until they changed the music. And then by some act of heavenly grace, she was let go. And before they could replace her, they got it on the air, and it exploded so much that all through the 80s, you saw Strawberry Shortcake, Care Bears. There was a Raggedy Ann series. There was, I call them the adorable characters. Right. And even Disney, I think it was 3 years later, moved to TV to do TV animation with Gummy Bears and Wuzzles. Also adorable characters in a fantasy storybook situation. Hanna-Barbera, that was probably the last time they really, that was almost a decade of success with the Smurfs.
Really incredible. Yeah. When they came out, people that were watching it at that time, it was a little bit after me, but they were, that's all there was. You saw it everywhere. I think, didn't they have some of them in the Thanksgiving Day parades too? Yeah. They were a part of like the psyche of America, right?
Well, they were actually in there's a section in the book, and I do occasional podcast episodes about Kings Island in Kings Mills, Ohio, near Cincinnati. And then there was King's Dominion in Richmond, Virginia, and Canada's Wonderland and Australia's Wonderland. All of those parks were owned by Taft, which owned Hanna-Barbera in the late 60s. So they had Hanna-Barbera lands. and they had the characters walking around and things like Universal Studios Florida had it then when Universal was making deals, for the Jetsons movie, and they had an attraction. But for many years, there was an Enchanted Voyage ride at Kings Island, and it was like Small World. You went into a giant TV set, and you passed all the different, characters and their settings and stuff. And then the Smurfs hit so big that they completely revamped the ride and made it the Smurfs Enchanted Voyage.
Now, are you somebody who would make sure that you visit all of these parks and all these places as much as you're writing and documenting, and you're a historian and an author and a beloved writer? Do you get in the car? Do you get on planes? Have you been somebody over the years who's traveled to these kinds of places to soak it all up and see what it's like yourself as well?
Actually, the closest I got to Kings Island was the Viewmaster set that I treasure, that had some of the Hanna-Barbera stuff in it.
Oh, the GAF Viewmasters. I used to love that.
But it's changed since then. They went through a lot of different ownerships. There's a great book about Kings Island that tells that story. Paramount owned them for a while, but they're owned by Cedar Point. Well, Cedar Point's one of the parks. It's the Cedar Fair Company owns them, and Knott's Berry Farm and a lot of other places. And so I think it's Camp Snoopy at each, which is interesting because there's a set of characters that go back to 1950, but they're evergreen. That's the thing, is that they're really ageless. A lot of these characters have a longevity that
no shelf life. Yeah.
Yeah, and you just don't know with each passing generation what people are going to pick up on in other countries too. Top Cat is huge in Mexico, and Dastardly and Muttley very popular in Japan, and Wacky Races was very big in England as well. Top Cat was called Boss Cat because there was a brand of cat food called Top Cat, so they had to change his name.
I have in our collection the entire DVD series when they came out with it of Wacky Racers. That was, and when I saw it, it was a gift that was given on a list of things you wanted for Christmas a couple of years back. I said, I saw in the store. Now you don't see any DVDs in the stores, but I saw in the store a whole complete set, remastered, the whole bit of Wacky Racers, which tip of the tongue, but yet a little obscure compared to names like Flintstones and all the rest, but phenomenal. I mean, every afternoon. I mean, that was, I think, did that follow McGilla Gorilla on Channel 11 in New York, WPIX? Possibly. That was a really fantastic concept.
What's interesting
about that was a really interesting concept.
That was a network Saturday morning cartoon, but on CBS. But it was supposed to be an interactive game show that kids could actually play from home. This is how they were trying.
That I didn't know. That's revealing information. Yeah.
And so it was a co-production with Hanna-Barbera and the Heater Quigley Company that made Hollywood Squares. And I think they also made Shenanigans, which was a show I watched as a kid. We had the board game, and that was a Saturday morning show for kids. So the original concept was it was going to be an interactive game, but somehow that didn't work out. But the co-ownership existed for many years. And I think Hanna-Barbera or Warner or whoever owned them at the time bought the rights back from Heater Quigley because they had folded into something else for that. But in the interceding years, that's the reason why Muttley was called Mumbly sometimes, because they had to alter a character in order to get around the copyright issues. They didn't fully own every character all the time, because for the first 5-6 years, they were partners with Columbia Pictures and Screen Gems. So Flintstones and Top Cat and Jetsons and Yogi Bear and those things, they were like the trademark of you look at a box of Cocoa Pebbles for years and it would say trademark Screen Gems, copyright Hanna-Barbera. I think eventually that was dissolved and they owned it outright. Disney would do the same thing. They would have to sometimes share rights, or if it was a book or something, the author would have so much. That stuff gets complicated, but people often wonder, why do they just call him Muttley? Well, because for a while, it was, and then Dick Dastardly also.
Right.
Sometimes there was the Red Baron who was the bad guy, and not Dick Dastardly because he was part of Wacky Races. That was so successful. That was one of their spinoffs. They had Dastardly and Muttley and their flying machines. Stop the Pigeon.
Yes.
And the Perils of Penelope Pitstop.
Do you think, oftentimes, a lot of times in things that are created, there's a vision, but there's a message. Something, Sesame Street, we will have, access to, grew up with, has a message. Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood has a message. A lot of things that are, I've had a long standing continuing relationship with PBS and all of the children's programs on PBS. And we've raised millions of dollars to support those programs on PBS, on camera and everything else. There were messages. There's entertainment, pass the time, giggle and laugh and fall in love with your favorite characters, but then certain messages. Do you feel all or certain characters, certain of the Hanna-Barbera collection had certain messages for kids, for people, as whether it's getting along with people or dealing with greed? Or do you think there were messages that were positive and inspiring in any of the shows?
Initially, they were not really supposed to be about messages, even though there is no such thing as a creative entity that doesn't have some sort of message. Their messages were have fun, laugh, it's entertaining, be nice to others. Chopper took care of Yankee Doodle, and Yogi was fond of Boo Boo, but Mr. Ranger isn't going to like that. And the villains were usually comical in the early cartoons. The Flintstones definitely had messages about family and about friendship, and sometimes Fred was just totally out of line and he'd be put in his place. And Fred evolved over the series. The series changed, and then when Pebbles was born, there was a different tone to it, but there was also a much larger audience. So there were messages, but they were the basic messages of try to do, with Johnny Quest, it was get the bad guys to make the world, to save the world. Josie and the Pussycats save the world once a week to the tune of a pop song. So that was the initial way they did it. But by the 70s, because of shows like Sesame Street and because of they felt the need was there, they brought in a lot of psychologists. There had to be. Now, what Filmation did is they built the message into the end of the show. So with a show like The New Adventures of Gilligan, there would be a story, a funny story, but at the end, usually Skipper and Gilligan would have a conversation. He'd say, "Little buddy, we sure learned a lesson about suspicion and distrust, didn't we?" "Yes, Skipper, I won't do that again." So they were more like on the nose about it. Hanna-Barbera, it varied. Yogi's Gang was probably the most heavy-handed because that one was really about the environment, and about personal relationships. You had Mr. Bigot, a lot of litter, the greedy genie, don't be greedy. Each episode had an instance of an aspect of life that wasn't good, kids, and here's we see examples of it, and then here's how we deal with it. That was a show done with psychologists. But then Yogi's Treasure Hunt wasn't. So it just depended on what the program was. Scooby-Doo, you bonded with, the thing about Hanna-Barbera characters is if you watch them enough, even if there were 24 shows, you bonded with those characters. And it's hard to imagine now because there's an embarrassment of riches. There's a lot of animation on TV. There's a lot of cartoons of all kinds. And there's a lot of features you can instantly watch. But in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, there were theatrical cartoons, but they were not made to be seen in 12 in a row, even though they were. And so they were more disjointed. There were 7 minutes, 10 minutes, and they weren't designed to be part of an overall cohesive thing. Because in theaters, you might come in a month and see another Popeye. But with Hanna-Barbera, Huckleberry Hound at first was on once a week. Yogi Bear was once a week. Quick Draw McGraw was once a week. And then eventually they were syndicated and they were on every day. So suddenly you had these characters, brand new ones, in your house every day, always the same, always kind of getting in the same kind of scrapes. You knew what to expect for them, and people formed a bond with those characters that was never, I don't think even Hanna-Barbera knew. I don't think the television industry knew how people were going to bond with those characters in a way they never had before. So suddenly, and a friend of mine, Mike Lyons, we talk about this a lot. The Hanna-Barbera characters for many generations were like your neighbors, your best friends, your schoolmates, your pals. And Disney was that wonderful relative, Aunt Marge, who'd come every so often and you just wanted to be with her, but she couldn't come often because she lived far away. Or it was like a holiday. Oh, this Peter Pan's coming out, lines around the theater. It is an event. But Disney animation was not constantly available on TV until much later. It was parsed out in small pieces. Hanna-Barbera was constant. And that closeness creates plus they would bring their characters to shopping centers and community centers, and they were a little bit more accessible. You didn't have to necessarily go to a park to see them. Disney would bring their characters to hospitals and civic events too, but the Hanna-Barbera ones were much less formal. I mean, I interviewed a guy who was an executive vice president for Kings Island, and we talked about the Brady Bunch episode. There was a famous Partridge Family episode and a Brady Bunch episode. And I said, I got to ask you this. There is a scene where, there's the two banana splits and one of them takes their head off. And then Greg he switches places with the guy. And then he's like, it's me, it's Greg. And he's talking in there. And it's like, you never do that. That character is that character. There's only one of them, the one you're seeing. It's nowhere else. And honestly, at Disney, we truly believe that. We couldn't do our jobs properly. It shouldn't be anything but that because of children. That's what they see. But Hanna-Barbera, he said, no, that was against our policy. I mean, calling them animals, that's what they called them on the Brady Bunch. I'm going to be in an animal costume. Calling them animals and not characters. That was the LA writers coming in. And it wasn't like Kings Island and Hanna-Barbera and all had the power to say, no, you can't do that. We will send our brand people. They didn't have brand people. They were just happy to get exposure for this park, because Taft owned it. And they just were happy to do it. So they didn't nitpick. And the show still runs. And it's a great show. I mean, it's so Brady. I wonder if they'll mix up the two tubes with the special plans and the Yogi Bear poster and all that. It's so Brady, and they're all running around and they're dressed so groovy. But they played around a little bit with that, but it was okay because the informality of Hanna-Barbera characters, it didn't change. The world didn't explode.
Right. Right. I had Lloyd Schwartz on, of course, and son of Sherwood Schwartz, who created the Brady Bunch and Gilligan's Island and all these epic series and shows. And one of the things, and now you touch upon it in the upcoming book, the music cues, the music itself, the themes, and I told him, and I actually thanked him. I said, these shows, Brady Bunch and the others, whether it was a Sherwood Schwartz and Lloyd Schwartz production or not, or Paramount, the underscoring, the music used in the underscoring when Florence Henderson is hugging Bobby, telling Bobby it's okay and that kind of thing. And then all of a sudden, that very soft, melodic, warm version of the theme to the Brady Bunch is dropped down, and it comes in quietly. Do 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 do. You're hearing the theme, but it's softened, it's warm, it's enveloping, and how that enhances, locks in, solidifies the words on paper, the words being spoken, the feelings, the emotion, the tears Bobby had. It adds to it, it heightens it, it locks it in. And I've always been very cognizant of that. I love music. I love television. I love all these things we're talking about working in the industry. So I've always listened deeply to that. And we were talking about that, the importance of it, and how if you ever watch something like that and it was actually an experiment. Somebody said, watch something like that and watch it with the sound off, not hearing the music, and then listen to an episode of a TV show like that with the music on, with the sound on, and hearing the underscoring, the music underneath the words, basically, for anybody watching that doesn't know what we're talking about. And it's that music that comes in, and sometimes it's versions of the theme to the series or some other cues. How absolutely important and crucial that is to really capture your heart and your soul. Talk about the importance of that and how Hanna-Barbera was very, very cognizant of it and beautifully used it as well.
Well, first of all, you mentioned a couple of things. That Lloyd Schwartz was actually the guy in the banana split costume who took the head off. His name's in the credits of that. So you want to see what a young Lloyd looks like in that episode. Also, as far as the Brady Bunch, they recorded 2 songs from Charlotte's Web, which is one of their greatest, Hanna-Barbera's greatest films.
Just so you know, these things that are happening in front of you right now, where I say something and Greg all of a sudden has it in his hand, we did not rehearse this. He's the guy.
It's just me. You know, unfortunately, I'm married to a saintly woman who has the patience beyond, because she understands, and she also can quote. You know, she went through the entire book helping me with the editing and stuff. And so now when we watch something, that's Hokey Wolf. Yeah, I remember that chapter where we had to figure out which one was the. And he said, so now it's like, and I'll mention something. She says, you don't have to tell me. I read that in your book. So yeah, she was truly
side by side.
Times when I would say to her while I was writing it, I'm not really sure, because it was like, this isn't about records, but records are what I know, and it's the least known area of Hanna-Barbera, and yet it's so fascinating. They had their own label and all, and it worked in with what else they did. They edited and made their records right there at the studio for like 2.5 years. So that's kind of cool. And then all these other companies did it, and so that's cool. But beyond that, I just kept wondering, how am I balancing it? And she said, just write the book that's in your heart. You have the story to tell. I wasn't fine. I found a lot of great interviews of people of specific aspects. There's only a few people, some of them are I believe on the comments, but only a few people who've actually listened to a lot of them and know those specifics. So I wasn't writing it as if you know these records, you don't have to ever listen to any of them. They're just works, and they just intertwine with what else they did. And then you'll go, I didn't know that let's see, here's one that'll do, just to give you an idea. Why in the world did the Three Stooges do an album with Yogi Bear? How did that happen? That's the kind of stuff that's something that, whether I hear that album or not, I want to know that it happened. Or why did Fred Flintstone and Barney Rubble do an album saluting Mary Poppins at Walt Disney movie? What's the story behind that? It's very bizarre. It's very unusual. And there are remarkable, talented people behind all of it. But you hit on something that's absolutely the crux. Excuse me, I just want to push the records up because they're not. I better not. Okay. There's a big stack down there. The thing.
You want to grab for them? You can. It's okay.
No, I'm good. Actually they're in a nice accordion thing. So if I need to get anything, it's.
You're talking about the music, the underscoring, the importance.
Well, the underscoring and the music was part of the animation. The Hanna-Barbera cartoons for television were developed, but everything they did, and this was what I studied these, and I didn't get bored with them. I mean, I'm watching the MeTV Tunes now. Before we went on live, I was watching the Peter Potamus show and enjoying it. It's like, because you look for different things in their cartoons than you do in more grandiose cartoons.
Are you watching it with a critical eye as the professional, the historian, the adult, or are there elements of you that do bring you back to a time of childhood, of innocence? Are you transported? Do you allow yourself to allow it to sweep over you, to shut everything else off, and you go back a little bit to your own youth? Does that happen to you? And are you able to do it being the expert with the critical eye, looking at various elements, studying it? Do you sometimes allow yourself to just let the child in you rise to the surface?
Oh yeah, I absolutely am. I'm both. Absolutely both. I look at those things. I'm looking at a yippee yappy and yahoo cartoon and remembering when I was watching it and where I was, just like hearing a song. And I'm listening to every music cue and knowing what almost every one of them is from. That's a Flintstones. That's a Top Cat. That's a Jetsons. That's Alice in Wonderland. You know, and we really, I do, but I do look at it with a critical eye. You can look at something with a critical eye and not dismiss it as something that's there's critical and then there's critical. And I look at it as, okay, well, there was some animation issues there. That was probably a whatever, but so what? It was made by people with their hands. It's almost like, you know, it's a very pure form of art. Charlotte's Web is one of my favorite works that they ever did. And there's some scenes in there. It's like, my favorite is when Lurvy's eating pancakes in the morning. He takes the pancakes, eats them, and then the same pancakes are still there. It's like, so what? It's a great movie. You can see the brush lines moving. You can see what they call the living of the lines around the characters, that they're alive. There is something very vital about that. It is a picture stuck to a background or several pictures that is moving in front of you. That's quite lovely and very human. And in humanity, there's mistakes, and there are those who also say sometimes in perfection, the mistakes are part of the perfection. So yeah, I look at it, all of that's going on in my head, and the music too, and the sound effects. Hanna-Barbera has probably the most distinctive sound effects other than Star Wars. And you mentioned taking out the sound effects. You take John Williams' music out and you take Ben Burtt's sound effects out, you got something interesting to look at. You got lasers firing and people being and running through hallways and stuff, but it isn't quite, you know, you could almost make a dummy soundtrack with just clacking feet and like boop, boop, boop. And would it be as good? No. What Hanna-Barbera did was their animation was the sound. They got the best, no matter how the budgets were, even if the budget was sparse on a project, they always got the best possible voices they could under the circumstances. And starting with their core people, Dawes Butler, June Foray, Paul Frees, Don
Paul Frees, one of my favorites.
Janet Waldo, her voice is like magic to me. Talk about something, that voice, I hear that voice and it immediately just transports me. And so many others over the years who they added to the stable, Frank Welker and Michael Bell and Lenny Weinrib, so many of them, Joni Gerber, just wonderful people. And then people that didn't normally do cartoons would like do guest. I just was watching a new Yogi Bear cartoon from like 1986. Chad Everett was in the credits. It's like, really? I didn't even realize. So I'm always learning a new thing. But as far as the music, part of their technique with music and sound effects was that had to carry sometimes the lack of movement. So you will very rarely see something crash on screen. Usually it goes off screen and then you cut. It's like a low budget movie. It's like one of those film noirs, you know, made by the lower budget studios where the car would crash and they'd show someone going, and then they would cut to this like spinning wheel and some smoke. You know, that's what they did. And Barbera knew it, and he'd go through a storyboard and say, okay, this has to be off screen. So there's the sound effects doing a lot of heavy lifting. And then you had this music, the genius of Hoyt Curtin cannot be underestimated. And then his replacement for several years, Ted Nichols, was he was like what you would say with Warner Brothers. You had Carl Stalling, but then you had Milt Franklin, and you couldn't really tell. I mean, that's how good Milt Franklin was. Same with Ted Nichols. And then Howard Curtin came back. What people didn't know is that sometimes he would subcontract. So there was people like Jack DeMello who did some of the McGilla Gorilla Peter Potamus music, but it was in the house style. That house style changed over the years, but the technique of usually creating these cues was Hoyt Curtin's training both in commercials and in creating stock music libraries, which is what all television almost was doing. So very few Hanna-Barbera cartoons were post-scored. Very few. Some of the nighttime ones, because they had the money, like New Adventures of Huck Finn, some of those were post-scored. The first Scooby-Doo episode, What a Night for a Night, if you watch that, all of those cues you've heard for years fit. And you're going, that's the skeleton. That's what the xylophone's there for. So, and there's an airplane. That's why we're hearing Off We Go in the Wild Billy. But they would pull those, put them into the bank, and then use them over and over. But they were so well done, and the editors were so good at this that they knew how to make those work no matter where they were from. Now, if you were a fan, you knew what they were from. But it didn't matter to me, because it's like it's a cue works. It's funny. And I interviewed one of their top editors, and not only did he tell me how they did it, and they used just standard, state of the art, but standard equipment, but they wanted to make each other laugh. They wanted to see what was going to be funny, and I also, and you have to read the book for this, for the first time reveal through an editor named Tony Milch how the Jetsons sound effect of George's car was done.
Wow. So you had an opportunity to really get some information through deep interviews and a lot of opportunity to really get these compelling nuggets that we might not, or a casual viewer were just not aware of, how things were done, what went into it. I say that to anybody, whether they're creating music or film or anything, television or a show like this or anything. There's so much that goes on behind the scenes to make things look effortless, easy. I can do that too. And to be able to grab you and keep you, grab your heart and your soul and keep you for as long as you want to be there. And there's so much effort, blood, sweat, and tears behind the scenes to create all of this, right? It's a lot. It looks easy. It looks fun and joyful. But what goes on, the intensity of what goes on to create all of this behind the scenes is extraordinary.
Yeah, it's very hard work. And it's very exacting work. What Bill Hanna created in the 30s, well, he was a musician, and he wrote lyrics and he wrote verse, and he wrote the lyrics to almost all their theme songs, and he worked with Barbera. They shared credit on it. He worked with Barbera because the concept of the show is what dictated what the lyrics were. So they went back and forth, but it was Hanna who wrote them, and then Hoyt Curtin or other musical directors would set it to music. So Flintstones Meet the Flintstones, that's written by Hanna with help from Barbera and Hoyt Curtin. Huckleberry Hound, the Josie and the Pussycats theme, the theme to the theme, a lot of them. Sometimes they would use their pen names. If you look at Josie and the Pussycats, it says Joseph Rowland and Denby Williams. That's William Denby Hanna and Joseph Rowland Barbera. That's their pen names. Sometimes they would do it that way because they didn't always put their names down for music, but they almost always did work on the theme songs. And the theme songs are earworms. There's a great scene in Trains, Planes, and Automobiles that I wait for, where John Candy and Steve Martin are on the bus, and he says, "Why do we do a sing-along?" And Steve Martin sings, "3 coins in the fountain, each farmer sing happiness," and he gets crickets. No one's. So John Candy goes in, the Flintstones, meet the Flintstones. And then there's this big pullback with everybody on the bus singing. And it's like, it's a great scene. And it says so much about how that song means to people.
Absolutely. It must be hard for you because you immerse yourself in hours and hours of the study and research, as well as the enjoyment. What are your favorites? Do you have favorites of the characters, of the series, of the music that stand out personally for you, Greg?
Yeah. I've got a friend who says, Greg likes everything. Well, no, I don't like everything. I don't like fermented bean curd, and didn't like Superman 3 very much. And there
I
are,
don't like soggy white bread.
well, if it's soggy because it's been dipped in gravy, that's fine. You know,
That's good.
But as far as Hanna-Barbera stuff, there isn't anything that I won't watch that I won't find some entertainment from, even if it's like The Funny World of Fred and Bunny, you know, the unsold pilot with Fred Travelina, which has some fun. It has a great sequence with he and Pat Harrington doing these Lawrence Welk voices. Sonia Henny's tutu, you know, it was used for blooper reel. There is something about them that you can glean, but they're not all, you know, sparkling pearls. But if I had to pick stuff I love the most, I love the Flintstones. I get something out of it every time I watch it all the way through. And as I get older, you know, you watch it as a kid, you watch it as a teen, you watch it as a young parent, you watch it as an older person, you have so many different perspectives on what that show. And yeah, there were inconsistencies here and there because they were going real fast. They had no idea the play. They knew that they wanted people to watch these over and over, but they didn't have the kind of systems in place to get everything. Neither did a lot of sitcoms on television then. But it doesn't matter. It holds together. You've got Fred and Barney and Wilma and Betty, and then you've got these great realistic kind of episodes, and then you have these great when they go to the World's Fair and they go back in time. That was fun. You know, I actually said in my history class, Christopher Columbus didn't discover America, Wilma Flintstone did. It was right on TV, and the teacher was not amused. But I do have so I do love that. I love the Jetsons and Johnny Quest and Top Cat, all the primetime stuff. I love Precious Pup and Granny Sweet on the Adam Ant Show is a particular favorite. Wacky Races. Help, It's the Hair Bear Bunch. I love that because it's a throwback to the Yogi Bear kind of thing. The Genie cartoon where they, with Mark Hamill, they did a teenage genie and he was the master and she was very jealous. And Julie McWhorter-Dees was so great in that role, and Bob Hastings. I love the theme of that. I love These Are the Days, which was a short-lived show that was kind of like the Waltons. What a cast. June Lockhart and Pamela Ferdin and Henry Jones. I love the Smurfs. I must have sat through those 414 episodes, I'd say about 5 times. I love the Smurfs. I just think they brought a primetime holiday special feel to a Saturday morning cartoon, and that's not easy to do. Droopy Master Detective, great show. I think they did a great job bringing Yogi Bear back in the 80s. Yogi's Treasure Hunt is another one. And I liked some of the movies. Scooby-Doo on Zombie Island, a terrific movie. I liked the first couple of Smurfs that they did. And I will point out that the first Smurf movie, you know, don't underestimate a Smurf, because when that came out, its competition was Cowboys and Aliens, starring James Bond and Indiana Jones. And the Smurfs gave them a run for their money. And depending on who you ask, Smurfs may have beat those guys, but that's not always the case. It depends who you ask. But they certainly were neck and neck. So for a bunch of Smurfs to do that, you know, and talk about a theme song that's an earworm. They actually make fun of how the theme starts annoying people in those films. So I did enjoy those. I was surprised how much I liked the Yogi Bear one, where Dan Aykroyd was the voice of Yogi, because it stayed in the forest and it made Ranger Smith more of a character. And it was a nice little film. You know, sometimes it doesn't. My philosophy of remakes and reboots is fine. That's great. It may be for me. It may not be for me, but it brings that brand out again, those characters out again. The only time what I object to is when they market it as a replacement for something that is no longer considered relevant or acceptable or good or fun, or the old one's just so awful that we needed to replace it. I think that is a construct, and it is not respectful to the artists who made the films or the TV shows, and it's not respectful to the very core group that you have this franchise for, that you're trying to bring in partially to the theater. But there are some very successful Star Trek Next Generation is one of the best examples. There's a rabid fan base that was ready to hate that show.
Yeah,
there was no way you could top William Shatner and Leonard, and they did. They took it in directions they just couldn't believe. You can do it, but nobody in Next Generation was saying the original was effluent, like some happened. That's offensive. I think it's offensive, and I think it's bad advertising and it's bad PR. But what do I know?
It sounds like a new off-Broadway play, remakes and reboots. Kind of like bed knobs and broomsticks.
Yes.
Remakes and reboots.
But my top favorites. I love some of the features. I love The Man Called Flintstone. I could watch it over and over again. I saw it in the theater. Every time it was at the matinee, I went back. Hey There, It's Yogi Bear. Beautifully done film. Probably the two at the tippy top would be the Alice in Wonderland special, which is not yet on video, but they're working on it. That was What's a Nice Kid Like You doing in a place like this. That I have a strong emotional attachment to, because I saw it when it was new. I have the album. I've memorized both the show and the album. It has all my favorite performers in it. It has a great score by Charles Strauss and Lee Adams, fresh off Bye Bye Birdie and Golden Boy. And it's creative, it's imaginative, and every time I watch it, that one, I see things I didn't see. I was watching it. We did an analyzation on it with historian Jim Fanning, and we looked at it again, and I said, when she's on this unwinding road, why is she in a desert? And then it occurred to me, I wonder if that's the vast wasteland, because she's in her TV set. She doesn't fall in the rabbit hole. She falls through a TV set, and that's why she meets Zsa Zsa and the Flints, Fred and Barney, and Hedda Hopper and all that. And Bill Dana as the White Knight. Bill Dana, a wonderful man who made a lot of careers and wrote that special. That's very dear to me. And then Charlotte's Web, I think, along with Bill Hanna, I think that's one of their crowning achievements, because it couldn't have been made by another studio. And that's not to say that another studio could have made it technically better. I wouldn't have wanted that. It looks like a Hanna-Barbera film from 1973 when they had 9 series on the air. They had deadlines hitting them. They were doing industrials. They were doing live action. They were doing commercials. They had the studio, going. And still, when there was time, they put some of their best people on this. It has some beautiful animation. It has some okay animation. What it mostly has is a flawless cast, a perfect cast, and some of the best music that the Sherman Brothers ever wrote. And what I found out, and this is a whole chapter in the book, is things I didn't know about the Shermans when they were writing this, that were much a revelation. How some of the songs to them have personal meanings beyond that of the film. I was weeping. It was that film is about life and about existence and about faith and about friendship and about media frenzy, and how trends go in and out, how the power of the written word, the way people ignore the writer. It said so much in this simple farm, but it was so deceptively not simple. And I watch it as, what? It's a great motion picture. It just is.
It really sounds like as you were doing the research, as you were gathering all the facts and material, you were finding some real treasures and nuggets, like you mentioned with the Shermans, thing, that's extraordinary, and it's revealing, and it sort of like puts some of the puzzle pieces together with certain things. I would imagine some questions were answered for you. Some questions were developed as a result of your research. It was almost like a kid in a candy store. Really quite amazing, huh?
Yeah, and I had no idea when I set out to do the book that I would be asked to do a podcast. It's like, what do you want to do a podcast on? And I said, well, there doesn't seem to be one that's really focused on Hanna-Barbera and its history and its people. There are some animation shows that discuss various shows, and those I enjoy listening to, but not a show where we have somebody on and it's like, tell me about your career on and off, or even if you didn't work there, how did it influence you? And yet you've got on the screen the wonderful Jackie Joseph, one of my favorite people on one of my favorite shows. How could you have missed with Jackie Joseph? She was on the Andy Griffith Show and the Dick Van Dyke Show. She was in the original Little Shop of Horrors, and Melody was such a fun character. And it was just ideal casting. And she was on, I loved her on the Doris Day Show. Anytime you saw Jackie Joseph, she was one of those people, your eyes would just light up. There were some of those performers that look who it is. And she did this wonderful interview, and she was just, I cannot believe how I did not see the podcast coming. And we're going to be on a year in August, and we've done about 37 shows, many of them in pieces. We cut them into pieces. So actually it's more than that. But we had Tim Matheson on talking about his career as a voice actor doing Johnny Quest and being on Leave to Beaver, and then how he moved into Animal House and all. And he continued to do voices in cartoons. And now being on Virgin River. So that was great. And then we'll have people behind the scenes. We mentioned Kings Island. We had a performer who ended up being one of the very first performers to play Belle live on stage, because there was no Broadway show of Beauty and the Beast at first. It was a park show that was done in the Broadway style, and she was one of the very first. But she learned her singing, dancing, and acting chops in Ohio. Her hometown was Cincinnati, and she trained and was on stage there. She told funny stories about Jabberjaw, and because they had to walk around Jabberjaw, they walk around Scooby's, whatever. And then we've got another gentleman who's on this week, Dale Moore, who I worked with when he was at Disney, and he was an Imagineer, but he also was instrumental in helping King's Dominion get built, building models. He was talking about how you could put your head in the Enchanted Voyage and move around, and it was like you were inside it. He talked about doing posters and artwork and signage, and how that was a formative part of him working at Disney Cruise Line, at Imagineering, and even Dollywood. And Silver Dollar City. So that's part of the thing, is it's like, it may be a part of your career, but I want to know before and after and how it affected it. Or if you weren't there, because I've had a couple of major Disney animators on, from they worked on Aladdin, Lion King, Beauty and the Beast, Little Mermaid, but yet growing up, it was Huckleberry Hound. It was the Flintstones. That's what they saw all the time. Just like I said, you didn't see, not that was, that's just the way things were. So here's this top of the line artist, this celebrated artist, and yet part of their heart and soul is in these are not trivial. These are not, they're cute and adorable and they're fun and they're not supposed to be like, ooh. But the fact that they do that so powerfully and continue to do it, that's a powerful thing.
And some of the terminology that the characters used in these series, all the kids would say, all the kids would recite. I mean, even coming up with something like, yabba dabba doo and things of that nature. So many of these are still in our psyche, and it's incredible that they were able to create so many things like that, right?
Oh yeah, Hanna-Barbera would try to have as many catchphrases as they can, and some of them are actually trademarked now. If you see them on things, it'll be a little TM next to zoinks and a little TM next to yabba dabba doo. The book explains how Alan Reed actually, the story of how that phrase came to be, and it's a little bit more than the sort of short version where he's just in this situation and Fred says hooray and he says, can I say yeah? It's a little bit more to it than that, not a ton, but a little bit more, and it comes from his autobiography, which is very good. There's an autobiography that about him and about Dawes Butler that Bear Manor did that are very good. Then there were phrases that didn't catch on, uba duba, nobody says that was George Jetson's phrase, but meddling kids, that evolved. In the early 70s, nobody was saying, I would have gotten away with it if it weren't for you meddling kids. It took decades of the Scooby-Doo almost self-parroting its own format to the point where there are online on YouTube, there are montages of not just Scooby-Doo meddling kids lines, but like live action shows and sitcoms and movies where people said meddling kids. Because it's just so funny. It's so silly, and that's the other thing is like, what's wrong with silly? It's just dumb, some of the premises, Casper and the Angels, the story of that is, okay, it's Casper, the friendly ghost, and then his new sidekick, Harry Scary, who's mischievous and not too, he's sort of the silly, get in trouble one. And then two young female space cops who live in the future and solve crime. Go figure, where in the world did that come from? Well, I've been in meetings where you presented multiple things. You have to present multiple things. Walt Disney once said, gee whiz, it's pretty hard to choose from one. So you have to show more than one. But quite often, you will show three different things. And then the powers that be will say, well, I like this, but I also like this. Can you put this like it's a buffet and this is their plate, And you got to do it. And you got to make it work. It's like one of those Dell crossword puzzle games, take this and then make them fit. And Barbera went into, it is said, he went into a pitch meeting, and Charlie's Angels, Chips were very popular shows, and they had just acquired the rights to Casper. And he went in with boards for all of them. He walked out with a show that combined all of them. And it's a cute show. It isn't way up there on my list, but I'll watch it. Fred and Barney, they had the Shmoo from Al Capsule Abner. Where did he come from? Well, they must have done some deal where it's like, okay, we'll use the Shmoo. Actually, the Shmoo's a very appealing character, and he's a bit of a throwback to Gloop and Gleep from Herculoids, which as kids, those are our favorite characters. Gloop and Gleep are the blobby things. So that's kind of what he is, only has a cute Frank Welker voice. And all of a sudden, he's like the Fred and Barney are policemen, and he's with them, and they're solving a crime. I don't know. Wilma and Betty are part-time reporters, and Captain Caveman helps them solve crimes. If you won't buy it, there's going to be one coming next. I don't know why, but it's like if you read comic books, sometimes they'll mix and match characters for a little while, and then they'll go away and do something else. They would do things like that. The Frankenstones. I had Ruta Lee on. Have you had Ruta Lee? She's delightful.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
When I did her, introduction before, she's been on 2 or 3 times. She's amazing. And the last time she was on a few months ago, and I did the introduction for the viewers, she came on with that fabulous wit and dry delivery, and she goes, oh my God, Jim, that was the best damn obituary I've ever heard. And when that time comes, I want you to write it.
She was something, and she was a terrific voice actor, and they used her multiple times. And one of the voices, the most memorable to me, was she was Hydia Frankenstein. Now, there were a lot of gruesome Addams Family type families that lived near the Flintstones. But in this particular iteration, she was Hydia, and the Frankenstein monster husband was Charles Nelson Riley. So it was, and he was a TV repairman. So it was one of the funniest reboots they had done, and of course they didn't get along because he called Fred the strangos, you know, and they're not normal like us. And she would calm him down, and she became friends with Wilma, and it was like, this is just somehow, again, you can't explain this to someone and they'd say what, but it's funny and it's fun. And they had Paul Rubens was their son. And Hilda, what was it? Zelda Rubinstein was the voice of their daughter. You know, she was just in Poltergeist. There was a pretty cool cast there.
And what was the character, the little green character that would be on Fred Flintstone's shoulder? Was it Gazoo or
Gazoo? Yeah.
And the voice, that's a voice of Harvey Korman, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And Gazoo is polarizing to some fans because they'll say, well, jump the shark, you know, Pebbles, jump the shark. I think my theory with the Flintstones is it was on for 6 years. And in those 6 years, ABC transformed as a network and TV transformed very, very fast. More people were getting televisions throughout the country. Kukla, Fran, and Ollie is another example. You can actually watch full years of Kukla, Fran, and Ollie on their channel on YouTube, and it's fascinating because it starts in 1949, and they're going. We just put the coaxial cable in, or we're testing a color show, or we just added Duluth or Montana or something. They just picked us up because they had to send kinescopes throughout the country, and they would say we can't really do a holiday show proper because you're not going to see it for maybe a month and things like that. To the point where they had coverage in a very relatively short amount of time. Well, same thing with ABC. They're on, you know, always the third network, trying to go for the youth audience and the kids. And so they do this, and the Flintstones evolved as the network was. The other shows weren't on long enough really to do that. So you've got first the Honeymooners, admittedly, you know, the inspiration, no secret about that. That was well known at the time. Hanna-Barbera did not run around saying, how dare you accuse us of doing that? No, it was television. And you can say, oh, it's the Honeymooners. Well, and there's also people who'll say, well, Jackie Gleason was thinking of suing them, but he didn't want kids to hate him because of suing Fred Flintstone. That's probably true. Here's what's also true. Philip Rapp created a series called The Bickersons with Francis Langford and Don Amici. And he sued Jackie Gleason when the Honeymooners went on because it was similar, and he got a settlement out of court. So, and then if you go back to Laurel and Hardy, that they had stories where they lied to their wives about going to a convention. Sons of the Desert. That's the Honeymooners and the Flintstones. But when you take it and you put it in a different medium and you add animation and visual things, you suddenly find, and they had to find this too, it was very hard to balance the dialogue with the action for a 30-minute show. This wasn't just, okay, cartoon 6 or 7 minutes, let's just make it 25 minutes. It was, how are we going to balance the visuals with the dialogue? Top Cat was the biggest struggle because that was a very talky show and very sophisticated. But Johnny Quest was just the opposite. It was a lot of action and not as much dialogue. But with the Flintstones, it's a beautiful balance. And I did an essay and a podcast about the birth of Pebbles episode, because that's the bridge between the early Flintstones and the later Flintstones. And that episode is a gem because you can see how they constructed it with lots of gags, lots of memorable funny stuff. You know, Fred's pacing and he's wearing an actual groove in the floor. You know, things that Ralph couldn't have done because it's a cartoon. You know, unless it was Green Acres, which was a cartoon. But I love Green Acres. But that's where they were going. By the time they got to Gazoo, and I know I'm going to get to Gazoo. By the time they got to Gazoo, they'd already added Pebbles, added Bam Bam, added Hoppy. Every season they would add a new character, and they could publicize it. They had contests about Pebbles. They had contests for Hoppy that they win prizes. And there was actually a little song created and all. For Gazoo, you got to consider, now this is like 65, 66. What's on TV? Lost in Space, Bewitched, My Favorite Martian, Gilligan's Island, I Dream of Jeannie. They are still being very aware. And if that's derivative, well, that's the business. What did Fred Allen say? Imitation is the sincerest form of television. But by the same benchmarking, when Walt Disney built Disneyland, it was no accident what lands were chosen, because you had Main Street USA, which was the one place you had to go through, and until you got to the hub, which was kind of based on his Marceline, Missouri childhood, but also just a time and place of simple calming you down, getting you into the feel of things. And then when you got to the hub, Fantasyland was all the Disney films. But what were the most popular things in the mid-50s? Adventure movies, Tarzan, Jungle Jim, Westerns. Westerns were huge. And sci-fi movies about outer space and creatures, that giant ants that attack, and those are the lands. So you have to kind of see what the market is, and that's what the market was. And he built the show to match the and it was brilliant because the show matched. Same thing that Hanna-Barbera would do when they would pitch shows and sell shows. And Barbera would get frustrated sometimes because they'd go in with some genuinely pretty interesting ideas. He had bound hardcover books. He was so proud of what his artist did that he kept of all the concepts. But they didn't necessarily want something different and outlandish. They wanted, let's mix and match what, meddling kids with a ghost and a dog that's a ghost, or meddling rock and roll band that has a computer that gives them assignments or something like that. That's what when Animal House came out, remember, there were 3 frat shows, one on each network that season. When Charlie's Angels hit big, suddenly you had American Girls and Flying High. When Mad Men was on, you had what was it, the Playboy show, The Key or something, and then you had the Pan Am. TV does that. Doesn't always do it well, but it does. When it works, they take that, but they transcend it. That's what the Flintstones did. And Gazoo, I will contend, 6-season episodes had some couple type episodes in it, because but Gazoo was there. Gazoo was trying to get back to his planet by doing something good, and part of his attempts were to help Fred with his marriage. And there's at least 2 episodes where Fred screws up big time. And one, they play Rockopoly, which people think is an earlier show. No, Fred is extremely obnoxious in that and feels terrible afterwards and apologizes later. But that's a Gazoo episode. The other one about him wanting to be his boss, an insight into who Mr. Slade is and what he goes through. That's a Gazoo episode, and it's a pretty good one.
Right.
But you have to think about the fact that, okay, now we've got more children, so we have to have children-based episodes. We have to have pop-based episodes. We have to have some fantasies. They had fantasy ones, season 1 and 2 as well. So it's like the Brady Bunch. You had to have shows for Peter, shows for Greg, shows for Marcia. The scope got bigger. And so you couldn't do as many of those because that wasn't what the show was anymore,
Right, exactly. I mean, I've heard people say, well, the Flintstones was a children's show. And then others say, well, no, actually, it was for adults. Where do you fall on that?
Well, it was, in its first 2 seasons, undeniably more adult. The dialogue and then they had Herbert Finn, and they had a couple of writers from Honeymooners and from other shows. That was the initial sell. There were some critics that felt that they hadn't delivered and that it wasn't adult enough. I don't know what they were expecting. But what it was, one of the things that we talk about in the book is also the use of Hoyt Curtin's music, which was an emphasis on jazz before Peanuts, especially in Top Cat. And we had John Burlingame. I interviewed him, and he has a wonderful book about and you should have him on because he has a wonderful book about TV themes and scores. And he interviewed Hoyt Curtin and all these great. He just did a book on the Peter Gunn music, but the music Henry Mancini was doing, and all Dominic Frontieri and all that. That was the thing, and Hanna-Barbera was doing it too because Hoyt Curtin was a big band jazz, and so if you listen to Top Cat, it's Gershwin, but the Flintstones was that, and then it slowly got different, but still, if you watch every one of them, they're not all honeymooners. They're still, Ralph didn't lose his memory and think he was Frederick. That was season 1. That stuff, it was still cartoony.
Yeah.
But it did change. Now, Top Cat, I think they were trying to pay off that claim of let's do something very adult. And while I loved it as a kid, it was a terrific show. Primetime TV was still before 9 o'clock, was still kids were watching. They were not going to make it super adult. And it was the very pre-Norman Lear. The only stuff on late were mostly action shows, panel shows, Twilight Zone, things like that, scary stuff. But Top Cat was very dialogue heavy, very, very funny, very sharp. There's an episode I like to point out where TC falls in love with a nurse, and this is on the soundtrack album. Oh, I just might happen to have that here. Top Cat falls in love with a nurse, voiced by Jean Vanderpyle, who was Wilma, and he goes to pick her up for a date. He figures all the nurses are going to be off the clock, so he goes, but he doesn't notice that he's walked into the maternity ward. And he has a conversation with the expectant fathers, and they're talking about things, and he's talking about her, and he thinks they're talking about like women who go out drinking and stuff. She takes 5 bottles a night. Wow. And she drinks them down all by herself. And, so it's all that double meaning stuff going back and forth and back and forth. I actually did that scene in one of my school classes. I just recited the scene because it's a funny scene, but it's a show that you could have done on Dick Van Dyke or that, or even Barney Miller, a show like that, but it was Top Cat. So I think because it's a cartoon, some people assume it's for kids. Because it's a cartoon, I don't think people always take it as seriously and realize that had that not been a cartoon, it might have been treated and seen differently. But the stuff holds up, and Top Cat actually is due to be out on Blu-ray in August. And then you get to see what you see in these cartoons. Besides, the beautiful design of the characters and all, is you see how the artwork is designed, the colors are chosen, and when you get a Blu-ray, you get all of those different kinds of color, like Space Ghost. You get the different shadings and the magentas and the cobalts and all that. And then you see, wow, these things look really extraordinary. I mean, they didn't look like this when we watched them.
What do you hope people are left with when they read this work of art? And again, congratulations on it.
I hope that it's not the last. I don't think it's going to be. Mousetracks, while there were no other books about Disney records, the information in Mousetracks has traveled the world online, whether it's been credited or not. You don't own information. When historians are there to share. You're a steward of heritage. And anybody who works in a company, to me, who that has a heritage and has a backlog and has, they're stewards of it. And so I want to pass this along so that people know the significance of it, because I think that a lot of that significance has been taken for granted. I interviewed Fred Seibert, who was the last president of Hanna-Barbera, who created the What a Cartoon series, and with Hanna and Barbera gave us Johnny Bravo and Powerpuff Girls and Cow and Chicken and Dexter's Laboratory. They were Hanna-Barbera cartoons originally. He said they always had trouble with their branding, their identity, and who they were. They were moving so fast that I don't think they took enough time. Walt Disney was a genius at branding himself. Even from the early days, he had a persona. He had films and photos of what he did and what his name meant, so that when times got lean and the product wasn't quite as lavish, it was good, but it was never not as lavish. When you saw the Walt Disney name, you knew that there was as much attempt at high quality as possible. And you trusted that name. When you saw Walt Disney Presents The Monkey's Uncle, you knew it was going to be loads of fun, but it wasn't going to be Fantasia. But it was still The Monkey's Uncle, and Annette was in it, and the Beach Boys, so who cares? But that name carried a lot. And sometimes they were working with very small budgets too, or with Canadian crews making films with animals, or, low budget comedies or television things that were, or stuff done overseas, like in Europe. But you saw Walt Disney and you knew that that every effort was going into making it good. With Hanna-Barbera, you didn't see them as much. They didn't make as many appearances. They didn't have time and they didn't have the training. And I think that media savvy, people didn't do that in those days. Walt did. Alfred Hitchcock did it. Cecil B. DeMille did it, but very few did it. Now it's common to do. I think of that.
Sid and Marty Krofft, you didn't see as much. Yeah.
No, not until later.
Right.
You knew the names and not the faces. I think that exposure would have helped them and also if they had more of an idea of what they stood for. But they were going in all directions. In the 60s, they wanted to be an all-around entertainment company. A lot of people don't realize Man from Atlantis was pretty much their TV show, but it didn't say Hanna-Barbera on it. It said Herbert Solo Productions. And that's because they finally discovered in the late 70s that it was hard to sell a series with Hanna-Barbera on it because people were assuming it was a children's show. Man from Atlantis. So they got Herbert Solo, who was a powerhouse producer who worked for Lucille Ball and helped launch Star Trek and Mission Impossible and Mannix. They hired him. This was, this was a good guy to hire. And he ran that division of their company, had his own office, developed shows, but it was basically their show. And it was a pretty successful one. They went into TV movies and at first would put Hanna-Barbera at the beginning, but then after a while it would be at the very end, or it would just say copyright. The Gathering, one of the best dramas ever on television with Edward Asner.
Yes.
A man who's dying and is estranged from his family and comes at Christmas time. Joe Barbera was very close to that film because he had issues with his own father. And that is a powerful top drawer A-list film. People don't associate that, but they weren't really cultivating that. They were going too fast. And they were inventing everything as they went along because that's what you had to do in those days. So I'm hoping that I can give the breadth of what they did, what they mean to us, what they still mean, what we kind of owe to them from, and I don't mean just people being nostalgic. I mean right now, and what is still viable. I was stunned. I just found this out a week ago. The very first LP on the Hanna-Barbera label for the cartoon series one was Monster Shindig with Super Snooper and Blabbermouse. And it opens with a Danny Hutton song. And Danny Hutton worked there for a little while, and he sang a lot of the songs. And Danny Hutton became one of the Three Dog Night. And he interviewed with me, and Monster Shindig was released as a single and got reissued several other times too because he had done it. Well, a few years ago, it was covered on a brand new Halloween album, in a real heavy version of it. It's like this. There's a place for a lot of this stuff that can continue in its original phase or in new developments. There's a lot of cool characters. There's a lot of characters that are too much like others because of TV. But there's a lot of stuff of value in there. And there are still people like the people at Warner Archives who are reissuing a lot of these things who know that. So, that's the way I feel about Disney. That's the way I feel about this company. I think there is a rich, vital body of work that both is great in itself and also has potential for future development, both ways. Plus, there's a lot of cool records that in a perfect world, I would love to see get reissued, maybe for our generation, because the ones from the 60s are kind of out of date. But the Banana Splits album should be reissued. Josie and the Pussycats, I don't know if I have that handy, but the Josie and the Pussycats album has Cheryl Ladd on it before she was Charlie's Angels. and a phenomenal R&B singer named Brenda Holloway was her sister, Patrice Holloway, who co-wrote "God Bless the Child." The Josie music was great music, and they were going to tour as a live group. The three of them. Kathy Doer was Josie, and it was Capitals dropping the ball because they were really playing and singing and doing sessions, and they were preparing for that. They on the cover, they're in the outfits, so there was a lot of attempts at things that never happened, but the fact that they tried is pretty cool.
It really is. And the fact that you wrote this book for all of us to enjoy, which is coming out in a matter of weeks before you know it, folks, I think is a blessing as well. And again, whether you are an aficionado of everything Hanna-Barbera, or you just want to go back in time, or you want to relive childhood, or you just want to really study some of what we've been talking about, it's an extraordinary read. Again, I had an opportunity. Greg and his team, sent along the preview, and it was, it wasn't something physical. It was something that was really in here and brought back so many memories and so many thoughts, and answered a lot of different questions that I had. And I kudos to you, my friend, for taking the time to document it all and present it in a way that just draws us all in and gets us to think, gets us to smile like Hanna-Barbera wanted us to do, and get us to have some fun along the way. I think it's really,
that's what it's about.
It's what it's all about. Yeah.
And the cover is, again, I got Verklempt
really well done
cover, because they did such a beautiful job, and we talked to them about it, and it was like, gee, I wonder if they're gonna, and it's like they just delivered. The bird playing the record was the very first Flintstone animal device that was in the Frederick episode. That's the very first time they had an animal start to do something, make a comment to the audience, and then do it. So that was also one of the gadgets that was on the sketches when they were thinking of ideas. What kind of family should we do? It was like, well, the Stoneway piano, the record player was one of them as well. And then the background is just breathtaking to me, because that's the sound wave pattern that HBR Records had on their label. And it's one of the most beautiful. It's so simple, and it's so beautiful. And so timeless, I think, and very eye-catching. I mean, it can certainly hypnotize me. I used to just, like, as a kid, just listen to the records and stare at the covers and look at all the albums that I wanted to have someday, and the artwork is just on their covers. It was the same artists that were in the studio. They would just say, here, do this cover, and they were magnificent. Oh, and here's another strange. I just want to throw a strange one. This one, here's one of their strangest albums. It's Edgar Allan Poe's The Telltale Heart, and it's narrated by none other than William Castle, the notoriously gimmicky producer who used to have a skeleton fly through the theater at the House on Haunted Hill, and most famously the Tingler, was in the seats with the Vincent Price movie. Well, yeah. William Castle, actually, he co-produced a film with Hanna-Barbera with Christopher George that had a little bit of animation in it, but he actually acts this whole album out, and he just chews the vinyl. He acts up a storm, and it's creepy as can be because the sound effects are Foleyed. So there are some sequences in here that are, I would say, grisly. But what also is cool about it is the artwork on the cover, which is terrifying, is by Ron Diaz. And Ron Diaz was the art director for the Oscar-winning UPA short film, The Telltale Heart, narrated by, Captain Nemo guy. James Mason. It's on YouTube. If you've never seen The Telltale Heart that UPA made, it is unforgettable. So it's the same exact artist because he was their background artist. He's the guy who came up. He was the voice of the Roadrunner. He went meet meet when he would encounter someone in the hallway and he had artwork and he'd want them to get out of the way. He would go meet meet, and they used that for the Roadrunner. But Ron Diaz he did I think it was an American International film or a Hammer film where he did artwork for a castle. He did that kind of art, but then he would just turn around and do like a Magilla Gorilla thing. They were extremely versatile, and they would hand them the art and they turn it out, and it is with us today. And I want to mention too, I've been watching this MeTV Tunes thing. I like I said, just watched Peter Potamus, and before that, Wait Till Your Father Gets Home, and a whole hour of Casper and Harvey, and that is a really cool thing because that's going to bring a lot of these cartoons back for people who love them to see again, but also perhaps for people who've never seen them. And we don't have it in our area yet, but if you don't have it, you can get the Friendly TV. There's no vowels in Friendly, and it's very inexpensive, and it's a monthly service, and you get 40 channels, and one of them is MeTV Tunes. And I don't know, I couldn't resist.
It's so true. It's delivering it to those who remember and want to rekindle those memories, and it's also bringing it to a whole new generation. Sometimes when you hear music from 30, 40 years ago, for some people who are hearing it for the first time, they think it's brand new. They're like, oh, that's really good. What is that? Kind of like even vinyl records coming back. What are these? And it creates this whole new passion and interest in stuff that is legendary. And I think that's a cool thing.
There's always this school of thought of, it's a passing phrase. They've been saying vinyl wasn't going to last for, 10 years now.
Cassettes are coming back too.
Well, the main audience for vinyl is young people. My daughter, she bought the Fleetwood Mac album because she wanted the album, but she wanted that cover, the full-size cover.
Right.
You go into Barnes & Noble, and there's a ginormous vinyl section, and new vinyl comes out all the time on Amazon. And it is a tactile experience you don't get another way. The ideal thing is you get the vinyl, and then you can also download it if you want a digital copy. But having that plastic and playing it with that physical, it just sounds different. It just does sound different. But there you go. What's to say? I think it was last Christmas, one of the top Christmas songs turned out to be was it Let It Snow by Dean Martin? And it couldn't have all have been elderly people asking for that. It had to have been young people too. I was involved in when I was at Disney, we had an excellent presentation from we had a boutique agency of record, McGarry Bowen. And they came in and did a millennial presentation when the millennial market was just being explored. And they said they're very difficult to market to millennials because they have every option they can have at their fingertips. So it's hard to zero in on how you can reach them. And they said, but the main thing is to realize is they really don't care when something was made. They just care if it's cool. And they look through they drive forward, but they look through the rearview mirror. And I'm thinking, well, that's great news when you've got a library, because you can do reboots, but you can also reintroduce, and someone can say, and look at Columbo's success during the COVID. Kids were watching Columbo. You never know what's going to hit. The main thing is find a way to bring it to their attention, because there's a lot of competition for their attention, and then just see what happens.
That's it. You throw it up in the air. That's kind of like we did with this Entertainment Lifestyle Celebrity Talk Show series. And when you were first on, I started this as a pandemic. I whisper that because YouTube goes crazy when it hears that word, project, playing off my years on television, radio, and film, and still working in those industries. I said, what the heck? I'll put this together and see where it lands early in those days of the pandemic. And, reaching all these different groups and people with different tastes and interests. And we're now 4 years and 3 months later, and almost 1,500 episodes. Could you imagine?
No, it does pile up, doesn't it?
It
Yeah.
doesn't it?
Yeah.
It does pile up. We had Loretta Swit on, and she was like, Jim, this is unreal because MASH was on CBS 11 years and we did like 231 episodes. And what are you talking about? 1,000, 1,100 episodes. It's just, if you enjoy it, you do it. If you enjoy it, you do it. And George Mallory says, loved the special guest star episode on the Flintstones with Samantha and Darren Stevens moving next door to Alfred and Wilma. That is
that was because a part of the reason they did that was because Flintstones was a Screen Gems show, and George Sidney was the third partner who was from their MGM days, and he helped broker the deal that got them to Screen Gems. And Hanna-Barbera animated the very famous Bewitched theme song titles. As a matter of fact, one of the artists told me that when Bewitched was in black and white, they didn't just take color titles and film in black and white. They had to paint that in gray tones so it looked correct in black and white. And then when the show went to color, they had to completely repaint it again.
Absolutely. Yeah. Really amazing. Some of the trivia put together with all of this. Cheyenne Smith had a question. Not sure if this is something that you are able to respond to. Probably, I would think. Was Bill Dana the guy who did the voice of Jose Jimenez?
Yes. And he was a wonderful man who actually, Jose Jimenez, there are some who feel that character was stereotypical. He did not stop doing it for that reason. He stopped doing it because he really wanted to concentrate on writing and wanted to retire the character. The character he'd actually been given awards from various Hispanic groups and things like that. Bill Dana was a very low-key guy who was raised to do for others. And so he was responsible for a lot of his peers' success. He sat down with Don Adams, who was one of his best friends, and helped him develop the Maxwell Smart character for his show, for the Bill Dana show, which preceded it. And he said, what kind of voice? And so he said, well, I do this impression, I do this impression, I do this impression. And when they got to William Powell, he says, well, work with that. And Tennessee Tuxedo cartoon actually even predates, well, I think it's the same time as Bill Dana. But he was responsible for some of the phrases because he was a writer. He also wrote the episode of All in the Family with Sammy Davis Jr. But for Hanna-Barbera, he wrote the special for Alice in Wonderland. He appears as the White Knight in the special. And then he also later did an album with the Flintstones and Jose Jimenez in A Time Machine, which is a real cute album. He's a great man. I'm hoping to interview his widow on a future podcast. I talked to her once, and she's just the nicest lady.
Congratulations on this and all that you do. Many years, of course, working with Disney as well, celebrating here, Hanna-Barbera, and everything else that you celebrate. I've always done that, and I plug into what you're doing, and I think it's beautiful. And I know it's something that you get so juiced and excited and passionate about, and it translates well. And even when you come on our show, and this again is your return engagement, and we're so happy to have you here, Greg. And as I always say, we're going to keep that porch light on for you. Love having these chats with you. It's like talking shop, but then sort of learning as we go and having fun, and even reverting back a little bit to childhood. I think after this conversation, this episode of our show, I'm going to pull out the Matchbox cars and Hot Wheels and get on the floor and play with them because we still have them all.
I still have
and the
all
baseball cards. We have those too.
I've got all the Viewmasters, with the monkeys and the flying nun and the Land of the Giants. Got them all. I love them.
I remember there was one too. There was Aesop's Fables too. Was one that was a GAF Viewmaster. Well, you had the first one, the red one. And then if you were good, you may get for birthday or Christmas or what have you, the one that was sort of like beige. It was bigger and it had the sound, button for the audio. So you can actually hear what you were seeing, which was kind of cool, huh?
Yeah, I remember when the a spokesperson for GAF was Henry Fonda, and he did a commercial for that. The GAF Viewmaster.
Exactly. Boy, all the things we had, kaleidoscopes and just so many cool things. And Roger, thank you very much. Son,
Oh, Roger, yes.
son of Slate checking in.
Oh
Great
God,
show.
Stevenson was a fixture. He was the original Johnny Quest, Dr. Benton Quest. He was Mr. Slate. He said meddling kids more than any actor who ever lived. And he was Mr. Peevely. He could do funny voices. He could do serious voices. That he simply was a fixture at Hanna-Barbera.
Pierre Kelly factoid Hanna-Barbera did the opening sequence for the 1979 game show Woo. Wow.
Oh, that's right. They did. Yes, that had animated sequence in it. They did some of the oddest things for TV. Yeah.
Roger also adds, and nice to welcome everybody. Roger, welcome to the Jim Master Show, and everybody, and all of our faithful regulars that are with us too. H&B Hanna-Barbera also animated the intro to I Love Lucy for Philip Morris.
Yes, and his father was the announcer. They actually did the
I Love Lucy. Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Let's see. We have Nicholas Malone. Welcome, Nicholas. If Warner Brothers Animation ever does a reboot of Hanna-Barbera, Laugh Olympics, would you like to be a music consultant?
I'd like to be part of any of that kind of stuff. Laugh Olympics I was just watching that, and that is a cool show too. It's kind of like Wacky Races, except that it reunited original characters, it brought in new ones, and it was sort of based on the Battle of the Network Stars, but it was animated. But when you're a kid watching on Saturday morning, you're not thinking about, is this live or not? It just felt like it was happening. And they had
correct, right.
There's people who actually online actually list what the scores were for the different teams and stuff, who won which one and stuff. It was a real fun show, and I think that has its own following as well.
Oh, absolutely. I remember Battle of the Network Stars, absolutely. And then wasn't it a little bit later in the day, the Wild World of Sports with Jim? Oh, I'm thinking of what was his name? He was the legendary announcer. They would always show, the thing that stood out in that open was that skier that came down and flipped and flipped and flipped.
Yeah. The agony of defeat.
The agony of defeat. Things like that became really part of. Are we missing some of that in our world now?
Well, people, just by the fact that everybody has a different sort of flume to go into of what they watch, there's not a whole lot of people watching everything all at once. But just because everybody isn't watching stuff at the same time doesn't mean they can't watch the same thing at different times and still share that. The main thing is that people need to be aware that there's more out there beyond just what pop-up ads show you.
Right, exactly. And that was Jim McKay.
Jim McKay. Yes.
On ABC, Wild World of Sports. Absolutely. This was amazing, my friend. Really appreciate it. We always fill it in. We did, oh boy, about 2 hours of what felt.
Oh my.
2 hours. Just under 2 hours. Let's see. Let's get it a couple of seconds. 30 seconds. 10, 9, 8. Always amazing, Greg. And you're a great friend of our series, and we really appreciate it. And I love having you on. And again, congratulations on the book. Book will be available, of course, Amazon. They can pre-order and everything. Books are sold, right?
Yeah, you can go to the University Press of Mississippi website. Sometimes they have sales. They just had a 50% sale about a week ago. They have them all the time. You can get it at Barnes & Noble, and you can get it at pretty much all of them. If you pre-order, sometimes Amazon will give you whatever their lowest price was at the time. August 15th is the projected date for it. Going to be at San Diego Comic-Con on, I think it's the 27th. We're going to be doing a Hanna-Barbera panel with Tim Matheson and Tom Cito and Katie Lee, who is on the Smurfs, and the great Mark Evanier. So lots of exciting stuff coming up.
That's amazing, my friend. As always, thanks for all you do. And I hope you enjoyed the time with me as much as I absolutely have with you, my friend.
I'm very grateful, Jim. Thank you so very much.
The pleasure is all mine. Come back and see us again. And congratulations on the book. And continue, of course, spreading the word about the Jim Masters Show Live series. Always appreciate you doing that. And thanks for all the time and all the memories. And we'll have you back soon, okay? And good luck with the book.
Okay.
Number one,
Thanks,
bestseller.
everyone. Thanks to everybody who
All of
commented.
our lovities and new folks watching as well. We appreciate everybody with the comments. And don't forget to leave a comment on our YouTube channel. And if you enjoyed this episode, truly, it does take a village. We would love it. And it would be nice to see if you could give this episode a like. There's a little thumbs up icon, a like thumbs up icon on our YouTube channel on this episode. Like, share this on your social media, the link, and leave a comment in the comments section. And subscribe to our YouTube channel, Jim Masters TV, where we have all of these great episodes and special friends and celebrity guests and so much more, like our good friend Greg joining us here. Greg, thank you very much. And a couple of hours here chatting. You're going to go make a sandwich now?
Gonna make a sandwich and see what happens to Peter Potamus.
There you go. That's it. Sandwich first. Priorities. You be well, my friend. Okay. We'll chat again soon.
Thanks very much again. Deeply appreciated. Thank you all.
Pleasure is all mine, my friend. You take care and be well. Cheers. Yabba dabba doo. We love you all. Thanks for being with us. Come see us again right here on the Jim Masters Show. Be well. Take care. Spread the word. Don't forget to love one another. Take care of one another. And don't forget to take care of yourself and love yourself. See us again right here in Lovely Hall on the Jim Masters Show. Cheers.